Today we are going to sew together this block that we made the points for, and then I'll sew together a second block and the second layout for the cover quilt from a different vantage point. So on page 9 you do have layouts for the two different blocks from the cover quilt, just so that's easy to access. And on page 10 it tells you what piece goes where, so you know exactly what pieces you are looking at, and then we start to talk about how to sew the pieces together. Some of you may have sewn straight seams before, which is what we are doing to sew the block together. And I'll kind of demonstrate that with this. You can read through the pattern on pages 10 and 11 to learn how to sew pieces together into a row, and also how to iron your pieces. This is one of the versions for the two different versions for the cover quilt blocks. And I laid all of my pieces out following the diagrams in the pattern with my middle of star, piece A, and on either side I have a piece C with piece B points. And then I filled in the background with my every other of the purple and the pink. So our next block that we'll do, and I'll show a different viewpoint, and I'm going to show chain piecing on that block, will be the block that has the purple and the blues. So it'll be a different layout in terms of the background. But your both blocks, any block you make, always have the center square being the middle of the star. And on the right and the left, the top and the bottom, the 4 squares that are have 2 points on each square to complete that star. To get started, we are going to sew these 2 squares together, and we want to sew these 2 edges to each other. So I'm going to pull these over here in the exact same position, and we want to put these right sides together, which this side facing up is the right side of the fabric. So I'm going to flip this square over with the right sides of the fabric facing each other, and I'm aligning the 2 edges that we want to sew together so they're perfectly aligned. And I'm going to stitch from the top to the bottom 1/4 inch away from the edge. Sometimes you'll want to back stitch or lock stitch at the top and bottom of when you're sewing 2 pieces together. I wouldn't worry too much about that for a full block, because hopefully you're sewing a full block together at one time. If you are not going to be sewing this block all together at one time, then you could backstitch at the top and bottom. There should be a button on your machine that helps you do that, and that just means that your stitches, you're going to sew forward a few stitches and then push the backstitch button and sew backwards over those same stitches, and then let go of the backstitch button and then sew forward again, and it kind of locks your stitches in place, so it's harder for them to come undone. But it does take up more space in the seam allowance, and because you're sewing all of these squares together, most of these seams will be within another seam. The only time I would do a backstitch is on these outer edge parts all around this, but then you would not have to do it on any of these inner seams in here. So for this one, because it is on an outer edge, I might backstitch on this side, but not on this side. So I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I mark that, and it might be hard to see in this video, but you'll be able to see it in the next version of the block. I have washi tape noting where my 1/4 inch seam allowance is. You might also have the option of a foot with a 1/4 inch guide, or a foot that is a 1/4 inch from the middle of the needle to the edge of the foot. But you want to make sure your needle, where your needle goes into your fabric, is exactly 1/4 inch. So this is going to demonstrate the back stitch. Just that's all it is. It's very quick, and my machine is fast. This is an industrial machine, an industrial Juki. It is made for speed, and don't go this fast. Start slow and build up your momentum as you get used to helping that fabric feed through smoothly, guiding it if needed. Your feed dogs on your machine should hopefully just pull that fabric through. I do keep a hand on my material or pieces going through, very lightly holding, not really tugging anyway, but lightly making sure it stays perfectly aligned with my washi tape so I have the proper seam allowance. And when I get to the end, there's a couple things. So you'll see in this video, I have on my presser foot underneath a button that I can push to cut my threads and lift my needle. You probably don't have that unless you have a very fancy machine. So what you're going to do is you're going to either find a cut button on your machine and push it, and that will cut the thread and pull your needle up. If you do not have that, you want to lift your foot with the lever at the back, and you're going to have to raise your needle if your machine stops in the needle down position. And then you're going to pull out and you're going to cut. There's usually a little cutter to cut your thread. If not, you can just snip it with your scissors. And these are your two pieces together. So this is our second piece in our row, and we sewed it right sides together to our first piece, and we open it up and we have our first seam. To continue, we are going to, the pattern suggests putting it back into the same spot so you can see, oh, the next piece is this one where the edges touch. And again, we're going to take the next piece, put it right sides together with the edges that touched aligned, making sure they're aligned at the top and the bottom, and they're aligned so they're even here. If you need to pin this to keep it together and not worry about it, pin those two together about an inch away from the edge so you don't have to worry about that pin as you're sewing your seam. And again, because this is an edge row, you can backstitch at the top. You don't have to backstitch at the bottom. Now I'm lowering my presser foot. On my machine, my needle is up right now. As I start sewing, my needle will always stop in the down position. If you ever have to stop mid-seam and your machine does not stop in the down position, put your needle in the down position. You can do that with the turning wheel on the side. It will move the needle upside down. And sometimes there's a button on your machine that puts the needle down. I have a button and then it puts the needle down. I forgot to backstitch there. So you're gonna hear the cutter now. That's that noise, and that cuts my threads so I can pull it right out. It keeps my threads close to the fabric and allows to save a little bit of thread. Not all machines have that. I did forget to backstitch at the top. I don't think that's going to be a big deal. So you have 3 squares sewn together. You can take your pin out and open that back up, and now you can see your 3 squares together. So putting that back in the same spot it goes, and you can kind of see already that it's starting to shrink, because as we are sewing, that seam allowance is taking up ½ an inch between each two, so we're already shrinking a bunch. We're going to take our next square, piece C, in our row, and we are going to flip it right sides together with the piece next to it, edges aligned, making sure that those corners are really well aligned and this edge stays together along that edge. I am going to do my back stitch this time. It's just 2 or 3 stitches both ways. And so all the way to the end, I will lift my petal this time, and I'm going to pull out and cut those threads just like that. So now we have 4 squares sewn together. Popping it back over here, and we take our 5th piece C in the top row, flip it right sides together, those same edges that were next to each other, we are aligning together to sew. And again, if you feel the need for pins, please do that, putting the pins in like this. Now, putting pins in is a whole art in itself because you need to put the pins in without shifting any of your fabric. So try some different methods to see what works best for you. There are 5 PCs together in our row 1. That's our top row. We are going to continue through and sew each row together, and then we will sew our rows to each other. So I'll probably speed up and only maybe talk to you about when we're sewing on the squares with the points, because that might be some alignment things that I need to talk about. Otherwise, I might speed up the video sections for the other parts. In the event any of your PC with B points squares are not perfectly square, sometimes our stitch and flip piece B corners don't extend all the way to the corners of the 3.5 inch or 4.5 inch square. And so we have a little bit of unalignment. So when I am aligning a piece C2B, is what I kind of called them in the row diagram, I am making sure that these top edges and these side edges are aligned when I flip it over and I align the edges. I'm not worrying as much about the bottom points because we want the main part of the square to align with the square underneath. If this was a little bit off, that's okay. It'll be in the seam allowance, but we mainly want to align this part of the square that's pieced. And also when sewing, so say I'm going to actually do this. I'm going to cut a little bit of this yellow away. Okay, there's like a little sliver. So say your piece C2B is a little bit off like that. See how you can see the purple fabric behind it, hopefully? When I align these two sides with the square underneath, it keeps it nice and square how it should be. And then as I'm sewing, I am following the farthest out edge, and that's the bottom square for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm not angling my seam allowance in when I get to the end of this yellow because that will skew the black too much. So I'm going to open that up. Now, once you get used to the order of straight piecing like this, you don't have to pop this back into the spot every time. Just grab the next square in line. Remember that as you pull it over, which side is edge to edge that you're sewing. That mostly matters with directional fabric. In this case, this is not directional fabric, so I could really switch this anyway. And then flipping it over, again, this block has the pieced corners, so I want to align the top block C on top of it, making sure it aligns with the pink section of the block below, and I'm going to follow the purple fabric for my edge, just in case I could see any of the other fabric from the block underneath, from the square underneath, I guess. And there we go. We have the same circumstances for this block with this block. Fortunately, it points a different direction, but you are going to align the corners that are pink with the purple underneath and not worry as much if these points don't extend all the way to the edge. Okay, now for the center, because the center is attaching to the point side. So if this wasn't trimmed to a perfect size, we would have some issues. It looks like it's pretty good, but I'm going to show you a trick just in case these happen to be a little bit off. You're gonna flip this right sides together. And normally I would say if your block with the points is exactly the right size square, then align those corners and get to it. Sewing down this edge, not a big deal. If this side is a little bit off, you want to make sure the seam allowance is pointing out this way and your fabric square over here is spread out. I can see underneath where my seam allowance is, and that allows me to align this point with the corner of my seam allowance, and this is where I would pin for sure. Aligning this point with the seam allowance point underneath, making sure the bottoms go together, and I would pin right there, and then I would take the top, and you can maybe see from this vantage point, and align the point of the yellow with the point of the seam allowance on the back, and I could pin it again. And over time, you will learn how to do this without pins, but when you're starting, so basically what you're trying to achieve is putting this edge of your fabric a 1/4 inch past your seam so it aligns perfectly with the square underneath, and then you follow this square on top for your seam allowance. Once we have that seam sewn, you can take out and then you can open it up. The goal here, and I didn't quite achieve it, but that's okay, is to not lose these points in our seam allowance. You can do a couple things to adjust that. You could shimmy your seam allowance the tiniest bit over. In the grand scheme of things, you're not going to really notice that on your quilt. So losing a tiny bit of that point, I'm not going to sweat it. It happens too frequently. So we have the same situation for this block over here, which we are sewing on next. Our seam allowance naturally wants to come this way because of the seams on this side. We're going to force it to go the other way so we can do that same technique of flipping this over, aligning the points of this top square with the points of the seam allowance underneath along the edge. That will achieve a perfect alignment. And I can already see that this point sticks over the square on the back a little bit. So you could trim that off, which I'm going to do because I want to follow the edge of the back square for my seam. And so it's easier if I can see that. Taking out the pins and opening it up. We have one last PC for this row, so we're going to sew that on real quick. And we have our middle row, row 3. I think you kind of understand the concept, hopefully, of sewing on these with the points so you can align them with the seam allowance. So I'm going to sew the rest of this, and it'll probably just be quiet. On this bottom row, I do end up backstitching at the bottom because it's the outside edge of our block. Now, when we are sewing the rows together, we're going to backstitch at the beginning and end of each row because it's the outside of the block. So we're going to sew the rows together, and on page 11 and 12 are how to sew it together, and I also talk about the seam direction. So for any blocks that have pink and purple, you're going to do your seams in one direction, and the blocks with purple and blue, you're going to do your seams opposite so that they all nest nicely. What that means is that these seams on one row, this is the top row turned upside down are going to iron all in one direction. Now the pattern tells you which direction to do for easy nesting. Mine happened to be nested in the opposite direction of the pattern, so I apologize. I'm trying to make all my blocks the same. So there's two ways. You could go and iron each of these rows separately, alternating the rows, ironing them which direction as you go down. I'm going to do that for you guys, but in general, I don't iron until my block is fully pieced. And often that's because I chain piece, which you'll see on the next block. I'm sewing chain pieced and it's just quicker that way. But let's go iron some rows together. We'll just kind of stack these up in order and iron the rows into the right order, and then we'll sew together our block. Okay, like I said in the pattern, it shows to take your top row and iron all the seams in this direction to the left. Take your second row, iron all your seams in the other directions. Unfortunately, I made a bunch of pink and purple blocks already, and all my seams are ironed opposite of that, so just take that into account. This is my top row. As you can see, I am just very carefully ironing. I don't want to like skew the fabric, and then I'm going to turn it over and just double check that there's no excess like crease along the seams, and then I'll put that back kind of in the spot where it goes. Since I didn't bring my board over, it's just going to sit there. Then I'm going to take my row 2, iron it in the opposite direction, going over those points, just making sure that all the seams stay flat. And see how I'm going slowly so I am not skewing the fabric, and that heat, since I'm not using steam, helps press it nice and crisp. I'm going to stack this on my next one, and I just know that the bottom is now my top row. Okay, and I'm going the opposite direction again. You may note how I am kind of gently tugging in the direction that my iron is coming, just to make sure any of those creases don't happen. Sometimes if you're not doing a tiny bit of tugging, you can get some extra fabric crease on the front right next to your seams. Then back to the opposite direction. Being careful of those other seams in row 4. And our last row is going back this way. Ultimately, if I was ironing this, I prefer to iron this direction, so I would just flip this upside down. Let's switch hands, but I don't want to confuse you, so I'm going to keep it this direction and just go a little awkward the direction I'm ironing. Okay. My iron pops up automatically, so don't let the fact that I didn't lift it up scare you. So this is my bottom row, row 5. I'm just going to restack them in the order that they go on the block. And I will take this and meet you at the sewing machine. I think I've mentioned this before, but I do have to move my camera every time I switch vantage points, so sometimes I don't move it based on what I'm doing. This time I did move it, so if it's a little bit different vantage point than what it was for sewing the rows together, that is why. I laid out all of my rows in the order they go. Now what we're going to do is sew the rows together. So we're going to take our top row and we are going to flip it right sides together onto this row 2. And those edges that we're touching, we want those to be the edges that align. So I'm going to take these 2 and I'm going to align them. Now the awesome thing about this pattern is we have nested seams at any intersection if we iron it properly. A nested seam, let's see if we can see this a little bit better, is where one seam goes one way and on the other side the seam goes the opposite way, so they can kind of butt into each other and align perfectly. So we have that at each intersection here, which means we don't really have to pin this. If this was 2 long strips of fabric and I flipped it over like this to sew, I would align this corner and pin it, and we can do that just to help us. And I would align this corner and I would pin it. I mean, to be honest, I don't use pins a ton, but when you're just starting out, it's a good idea. And depending how long this was, I would probably almost pin in the center because you want those pins to help it stay perfectly aligned. So as you sew, you can kind of help the fabric be the same length. But because we have these nested seams in here, that's going to help us a lot. What we're going to do is I'm going to start with a back stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch a few, and then I'm going to butt these nested seams up together, and I'm going to have them kind of held until my finger gets right under the presser foot, and not under, but right up to, and then I'm going to, hopefully they'll hold in place and let it feed over this seam, and then I'm going to stop with my needle down and get these 2 seams aligned, and I will do that down the whole row so that we have really well nested seams. Don't forget your back stitch. It's very essential for the full block in case you don't sew your blocks to each other super quickly. It helps keep it all intact. I'm just making, as I align these nested seams, making sure it feels like it's the same height, making sure they're butted up next to each other, and making sure the seam allowance edge is well aligned. And I do that every time I go over one, I stop, because that's set those in place perfectly with the stitches, and I put the next one in line. And our last one. The nice thing is that fabric is stretchy. So while you don't want to tug and stretch a ton, you are able to stretch a little bit to help things fit. So there we have, let's take out that pin, row 1 and row 2. So if we put it back above our row 3, 4, and 5, we can see to do the next row, we want to flip this right sides together with our next row, aligning this edge and this edge. And we're going to do the same thing. Now remember, I didn't talk about this for the first row. We're going to align the points, and then as we get to each seam, we're going to align the seams. You could put a pin here and a pin here, or not if you're confident enough. I didn't talk about this on the first row, but on the second row I'm going to talk about this, because you'll see our seam was coming this way before, and now our seam is going into our presser foot, but the seam back here are going in the opposite direction. And you can see on this one maybe that I have a little bit of a wrinkle. Not that big of a deal. It's fine. It'll iron out. But in general, we want those seams to lay in the direction they're ironed. So you do kind of have to pay attention to that. As you're nesting the seams, you should be able to feel underneath and on top if your seams are pointing in the right direction. They'll feel too bumpy, I guess, if they're not pointing in the right direction. And as you slide over some different levels potentially on your sewing machine, like my silver plate on the bottom of my sewing machine and this little tray have a slight different height than the other part of my sewing machine. So you kind of want to hold those in place with your fingers. Again, not pulling, just holding in place, letting the sewing machine fully guide the fabric through. And my last nested seam, and then I'm going to make sure my points on this side are connected since I did not pin those. And we have our row 3 attached to row 2 and 1. So we're just going to continue that until we have all 5 rows sewn together. Every time, just making sure that our seams are pointing in the right direction and our beginning and end of each row are aligned to each other. And don't forget, this is the great spot to backstitch at the beginning and end of the rows. As you're going over those points of the stars along these seam edges, just make sure that your square is staying aligned, coming onto the block, onto the points from this side, and staying aligned over here. And it should stay aligned in the middle in case your points are not perfectly to the edge of the pieces. There's our row 4 added on, and then we have our row 5. We are going to flip it right sides together and do the last row. It's very easy sewing. Like I said before, my machine is sewing rather quickly, so go slow and take your time and practice so that you feel confident. That's what these types of patterns are for, is to help you have repetitive skills to build that patience and practice and give you confidence in what you're doing. So there is our completed block. What we need to do now, I'm going to turn this over, is we need to iron these horizontal row seams all in the same direction. So just like the blue and purple block, all of these vertical seams are sewn in the opposite direction as this color combination. We want to do the same thing. So either all of these horizontal seams on every pink and purple block you iron vertical, or no, not vertical. You iron up or down, but be consistent with the block. And then on the purple and blue block, you would iron all those horizontal seams the opposite of what you do for this block. So we're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to iron those horizontal seams all in one direction. So at the ironing board, I am actually ironing all my pink blocks so my horizontal seams go up. So I want to have the bottom of my block face down closest to my sewing machine so I can just kind of push all those seams towards the top. And I want to keep these vertical seams iron flat, and I'm just going to kind of slightly tug as I'm ironing because I don't want to skew these lines. I want them to stay very nice and straight, but I want to make sure I don't have any creases on the front, which we can iron out if that happens. But the goal is not to have it happen. So just ironing these all pretty flat. You can do a couple passes. Some irons will iron a lot faster than other irons. So just making sure they're as flat as possible. That will help you when you get to the basting part. And when we get to the front, I kind of like whichever direction my seams are going, which they're going this way, they're going towards the top. So I'm going to slide it down to kind of help guide those seams in the right direction. That might make more sense after you've actually sewn and experienced that. If my seams were ironed so they were all facing this way, I would have done that in the opposite direction. On the top, I'm just giving it a final press so that we have nice flat seams and no additional fabric in the creases here. Next, we're going to sew a block that is the purple and blue version for the cover quilt, and I'm going to show you chain piecing from a different vantage point.